Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into something
Mhm.
pretty controversial. We're looking at U.S. immigration policy and, more specifically, President Trump's plan to send 30,000 individuals.
Okay.
He's calling them criminal illegal aliens to Guantanamo Bay.
Wow.
And our primary source for this is a Fox News article.
Interesting.
Yeah. And honestly, just seeing that headline
Yeah.
raises a lot of questions for me. Guantanamo is usually
Mm.
associated with terrorism, not immigration.
Right.
You know, this feels like we're moving into some uncharted territory. What do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely a striking juxtaposition. I mean, Guantanamo Bay
Hmm.
has a lot of historical baggage, and
Yeah.
it's so closely tied to the war on terror that this move is
Yeah.
it's definitely thought-provoking. It immediately raises all these questions about,
Yeah.
the intent,
Yeah.
the legal basis for this,
Yeah.
and of course the ramifications of a move like this.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this a little bit. This article says that President Trump signed a presidential memorandum,
Yeah.
and they specifically say it's not an executive order
Okay.
directing Departments of Defense and Homeland Security to prepare Guantanamo for this.
Interesting.
What's the significance of that? What's the difference between a presidential memorandum and an executive order?
Well, a presidential memorandum doesn't carry the same
Okay.
legal weight as an executive order. It's more like,
Yeah.
an internal directive to those agencies rather than
Uh-huh.
like a sweeping policy change. But
Okay.
even though it might not have the same immediate impact as an executive order,
Yeah.
it definitely signals that the administration is shifting its approach
Interesting.
to immigration enforcement.
Yeah. And then there's this number 30,000.
Right.
Is there any significance to that specific number?
Well, the article mentions that Guantanamo has a capacity of 30,000 beds.
Wow.
So it seems like the plan is to use the entire space,
Okay.
which, as you
Yeah.
said, is,
It's a huge number of people
it's a lot of people.
and really kind of underscores the scale of this proposal.
Yeah, it's hard to even hear the word Guantanamo and not immediately think of like a really controversial place. Can you give us a little context about the history of Guantanamo Bay
Yeah.
and why using it for immigration is causing such a strong reaction?
Yeah. So Guantanamo Bay has been a U.S. naval base
Mm-hmm.
since the late 19th century, but it's the recent history that's
Sure.
shaping the public's perception.
Mm.
After 9/11, it became the detention center for
Right.
suspected terrorists, and it's been the focus of scrutiny and condemnation ever since.
Mm.
And there have been persistent allegations of
Right.
human rights abuses,
Yeah.
indefinite detention without trial, and just a lack of transparency surrounding
Right.
the legal proceedings there. So to use Guantanamo for immigration detention
Yeah.
with that kind of reputation,
Right.
it's a bold move, and I think for many people it's a really unsettling decision, especially when you consider they're calling these people criminal illegal aliens,
Yeah.
right? I mean, even that language is loaded.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to unpack that terminology and think about the implications.
Yeah.
So first of all, criminal implies that they've been convicted of crimes,
Yeah.
but the article doesn't say what those crimes are.
Right.
Are we talking about minor offenses like misdemeanors,
Right.
or are we talking about serious felonies?
Yeah.
That lack of clarity just leads to a lot of assumptions
Right.
and potentially fuels all these negative perceptions.
So we don't even really know what these people are accused of.
Right.
And then there's the term illegal aliens,
Right.
which a lot of people consider
Yeah.
dehumanizing and inaccurate.
Exactly. Illegal alien is a term that's often used to just generalize and cast a negative light on
Right.
all undocumented immigrants, regardless of their individual circumstances or reasons for being here.
Right.
And it really contributes to a broader narrative that I think is harmful and misrepresents
Yeah.
the complexities of immigration.
The article says that President Trump's reasoning for this policy is threefold:
Okay.
deterrence,
Mm-hmm.
preventing reentry,
Yep.
and targeting individuals that are considered dangerous.
Right.
Let's start with deterrence.
Okay.
Is sending people to Guantanamo really going to stop others from trying to enter the U.S.?
That's a tough question. I mean, we're talking about people fleeing desperate situations. They're seeking asylum.
Right.
They're seeking economic opportunity.
Yeah.
They're often driven by these incredibly powerful forces.
Yeah.
And history shows us that increasing the severity of the consequences
Yeah.
doesn't always lead to a decrease in migration.
Right.
People are still going to look for a better life,
Right.
even if it means facing immense risks.
Yeah.
So whether Guantanamo really acts as a deterrent,
Yeah.
it's debatable and I think would require a lot more analysis.
What about preventing reentry? Aren't there already measures in place to stop deported individuals from coming back to the U.S.?
Yeah, the U.S. government already has a very comprehensive system of border security and deportation.
Okay.
It's not clear to me how sending people to Guantanamo
Right.
would be more effective than what's already in place.
Yeah.
It might actually create logistical challenges and be a lot more costly. The article doesn't really address those practical considerations.
And then finally, there's this idea of targeting individuals considered dangerous. How are these individuals being identified as dangerous in the first place?
Yeah.
And what legal protections will they have?
Yeah, that's where things get really murky. The article quotes President Trump saying, some of them are so bad we don't even trust their countries to hold them because we don't want them coming back.
Wow.
But without clear criteria for what constitutes dangerous, it raises concerns about due process and the potential for abuse. Who makes that determination? What evidence are they using?
Yeah.
And what recourse do these individuals have if they're wrongly classified?
The article mentions that Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel has condemned this plan.
Yeah.
And he called it an act of brutality.
It seems like this could have some serious implications for U.S.-Cuba relations.
Totally. Using Cuban territory for a purpose that the Cuban government vehemently opposes could really damage diplomatic ties and create new points of contention.
Yeah.
So this move has the potential to ripple far beyond just immigration policy and impact broader foreign policy objectives.
The article points out that Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have both publicly defended this policy.
Interesting.
Saying that Guantanamo has been used to house migrants before, even under Democratic presidents. Is that true?
It is true that Guantanamo has been used to temporarily house migrants in the past.
But the scale and the context were very different. We're talking about a small number of people, usually intercepted at sea, being held for a short period of time. This proposal, though, involves potentially tens of thousands of individuals being held on land for an indefinite period. It's a massive difference in scope and intent.
It seems like the article is trying to downplay the significance of this by comparing it to past practices that were much more limited in nature.
Exactly.
But like you said, the context here is totally different.
It is. It's crucial to be mindful of those distinctions and not let historical comparisons obscure the potential magnitude of this policy shift.
The article also highlights these recent ICE raids and deportations, noting that over 7,300 people have been removed from the country since Trump's inauguration.
Wow.
How does this fit into the bigger picture of his immigration policies?
Well, this is part of a broader trend we've been seeing under the Trump administration to restrict immigration and increase deportations. We've seen several executive orders aimed at limiting asylum, making it easier to detain and deport people, and strengthening border security measures. These raids and deportations are a very tangible manifestation of those policy changes.
And these policies haven't been without controversy or legal challenges?
A lot of these policies have faced legal challenges with varying degrees of success. The legal landscape around immigration is incredibly complex, and it's constantly evolving. And these court battles, I think, are likely to continue.
It sounds like there's a lot more to explore here.
Definitely.
Especially when it comes to the potential consequences of these policies. Both for the people who are directly affected by them and for U.S. society as a whole.
Absolutely. This has really just scratched the surface of a very complex and multifaceted issue. We need to be thinking about the human impact, on those being detained, and the potential long-term consequences of using Guantanamo Bay in this way.
You're right. You bring up a really important point about the human impact. I mean, the article focuses on the policy itself. But it's easy to forget that we're talking about real people's lives.
Exactly. These aren't just statistics or political talking points. We're talking about individuals with families, with hopes, with dreams. And to send them to a place like Guantanamo with its reputation, it raises some serious ethical concerns for me.
The article doesn't really go into detail about what the conditions would be like at Guantanamo for these individuals. Do we have any insights into that?
We don't have specifics from this particular article, but we can kind of look at past reports and accounts from Guantanamo.
Okay.
Detainees have reported things like overcrowding, limited access to medical care, and significant psychological distress stemming from the isolation and just the uncertainty of their future.
Yeah.
And these conditions have been criticized by human rights groups.
Of course.
And it's reasonable to assume that those same issues could come up if the facility is used for immigration detention.
That's a pretty grim picture. We've been using this term criminal illegal aliens, which is what the article calls them.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to unpack that a little bit. What does that even mean in this context?
You're absolutely right. The language is really crucial here. The term criminal implies that there's been a conviction, but the article doesn't clarify what these individuals have been convicted of.
Yeah.
It could be anything, from minor offenses like traffic violations to more serious crimes. Without knowing the specifics, it's really impossible to assess if it's justified to send them to Guantanamo.
So we're left with a lot of ambiguity.
Yeah.
And then there's this term illegal aliens, which, like we said earlier, is dehumanizing. And it's often used to paint all undocumented immigrants with the same brush.
Exactly. It just feeds into this narrative that ignores the complexities of immigration and reduces these individuals to a label.
The article mentions that the Trump administration has been highlighting these recent ICE raids and arrests on social media and even showcasing specific individuals and their alleged crimes.
Wow.
What's your take on that approach?
That's a tactic that's been used before, and it's often used to try to evoke fear and justify stricter immigration policies.
Okay.
So by focusing on individual cases, and especially ones that involve violent crimes, it creates this sense of urgency and paints this picture of a society that's under threat.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that these individual cases don't necessarily represent the experience of all undocumented immigrants. It's a form of selective storytelling that can be very misleading.
It feels like they're trying to build a case for this Guantanamo policy.
Right. By picking out very specific examples that fit their narrative.
It definitely seems like a way to shape public perception and try to create support for their agenda. But as informed citizens, we need to be critical of that kind of rhetoric. And we need to demand a more nuanced and balanced approach to immigration.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the potential long-term consequences of using Guantanamo Bay for immigration detention.
Yeah.
What kind of precedent does this set, and what message does it send to the international community?
I think it's a slippery slope. If we start using a facility that's associated with terrorism for immigration purposes, where does it end? What's to stop the government from expanding its use to other groups that they deem undesirable? It also further erodes America's standing in the world. Guantanamo is already seen as a symbol of human rights abuses in the eyes of many, and using it for immigration detention only reinforces that negative perception. It feels like we're opening a Pandora's box with a lot of unintended consequences.
The potential for unintended consequences is huge.
Yeah.
And we haven't even talked about the legal ramifications. The legal framework surrounding Guantanamo is already incredibly complex and controversial. Using it for immigration detention could lead to even more legal challenges and just complicate matters even further.
The article doesn't really address the legal complexities of this, does it?
It only mentions very briefly that Guantanamo has been used for migrants before.
Right.
But as we've discussed, the scale and the purpose here are just completely different.
Right.
This isn't like a temporary housing situation.
Yeah.
It's potentially indefinite detention on an unprecedented scale.
Wow.
So there are very serious questions about whether this would even be legally permissible.
It seems like this policy is driven more by political motivations than a real attempt to address the complexities of immigration.
It's hard to argue with that. It seems more like a symbolic gesture.
Yeah.
Aimed at appealing to a certain base than a thoughtful policy solution. And that's concerning.
Right.
Because real people's lives are at stake.
You've mentioned the human impact a few times, and I think it's so important to keep circling back to that. I mean, behind all the legal arguments and the policy debates are individuals who are directly affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. We can't lose sight of that. We're talking about people with families, with dreams, with aspirations. They deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their immigration status. And this policy seems to completely disregard that fundamental principle.
It's easy to get caught up in the political rhetoric.
Oh, really?
But at the end of the day, this is about human lives.
It is. And we need to remember that.
Yeah.
And we need to hold our leaders accountable for the choices they make and the impact those choices have on people and on communities.
This has been a really sobering look at a very complex issue. We've only scratched the surface, but it's clear that there's a lot more to unpack here.
Yeah, there is.
There's a lot of questions that need to be answered.
Absolutely. This isn't just an immigration issue.
Yeah.
It touches on human rights legal precedents, foreign policy, and I think the very values that define our society. It's so crucial that we continue to have these conversations and that we demand transparency and accountability from our government.
This has been a lot to take in. We talked about the history of Guantanamo and the potential legal and ethical implications and, this really dehumanizing language that's often used when we're talking about immigration. So where do we even go from here? Like, what can our listeners do?
That's a good question.
If they want to learn more or even get involved.
Well, I think knowledge is power.
Right.
And the first step is just staying informed.
Okay.
There are a lot of really reputable organizations out there working on these issues, both nationally and locally. You've got the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the National Immigration Law Center, just to name a few.
Right.
Do your research.
Yeah.
Find organizations that you connect with and see how you can support their work.
So that could be, volunteering your time, donating.
Exactly.
To support their efforts.
Yeah.
Or even just staying up to date on what's happening and spreading awareness.
Absolutely.
About the challenges that immigrants and refugees are facing.
Yeah, and don't underestimate the power of your voice.
Right.
Contact your elected officials.
Okay.
Share your concerns about this policy.
Yeah.
Let them know that you care about this issue.
Okay.
Public pressure can make a difference, especially when it comes to shaping policy.
Sometimes it feels like just one voice can't make a difference.
It's not true.
Okay.
Every voice matters.
Okay.
And when we come together and speak out against injustice,
Yeah.
we can create real change. Change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
But it takes that consistent effort and a collective commitment to building a more just and humane society.
So stay informed.
Yeah.
Speak up and support organizations doing important work.
Exactly.
Those are all things our listeners can do.
Yeah. And I think the key takeaway from all of this is the importance of critical thinking. We can't just accept information at face value, especially when it comes to these really complex and emotionally charged issues like immigration.
We need to be more discerning consumers of information.
Absolutely.
Question the narratives that are being presented to us.
Yes.
And seek out different perspectives.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in all that rhetoric, but we need to dig deeper, examine the facts, and consider the human impact of these policies.
I like that. The way we treat the most vulnerable among us really does reflect our values as a society.
I think that's a great point.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive today.
It's been my pleasure.
We hope this conversation has been informative and maybe even encouraged you to learn more about this issue.
I hope so, too.
And form your own informed opinions.
Yes.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep learning.
Sounds